Welcome to a new episode of Product Directions Podcast, 100 Product Strategies. We are your insider access to top product leaders shaping the strategy of the most diverse industries today. I'm your host, Nacho Basino, and I'll be digging into the real-life situations, problems, and frameworks used for strategy with product people all around the world in all kinds of products and markets. While there is no recipe for success, listening to others' experiences may give you the edge you need to solve your next strategic challenge. Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Andrew Skotzko, and he has been a product leader for many years now and has some interesting stories to share with us. So, Andrew, welcome to the program.
Nacho, thank you. It's so good to be here with you.
Can you talk a bit about yourself and who you are and what you have been doing lately?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you said, I've been in the product game for a long time. And like many of us, I think I have that weird background where I bounced around and did a lot of different things. I started my career actually in marketing and then realized I wanted to build stuff. So I became an engineer, did that for a number of years before discovering this wonderful thing that's also weird called product. And I've been doing that ever since for the last, 12 years or something. And so now I was an operational product leader up until about a year ago. And then I took a little break. And then now I'm a full-time product coach. So I work with product leaders and their teams really to build and scale the right product and the culture and really unlock this lovely thing we all like to talk about with product-led growth. So that's what I spend my time on these days.
If they know what product-led growth is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting. Knowing that you have been in many different companies, I am sure that you will have some interesting stories. But the typical opening question for me is, okay, can you tell us about one time when you were doing product strategy and kind of walk us through the process, the steps that you took there? What would be an interesting story to share?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take us back a couple of years here. So this goes back to, 2018-ish, 2018, 2019. And so I was working at a place called Applied Invention, which is a phenomenal, you can think of it kind of like a skunk works. And so what we did was we did joint ventures with Fortune 100 and 500 companies. So we would basically team up with these big companies and go after new markets that could be created. And so we would build out together, we would fund and build out a whole product, usually basically launch an entire new division of a company. So what we were working with, we saw this opportunity we were all very interested in the climate space and also in the aquaculture space. And this had started a few years prior. So basically, if you zoom way out, if you go back to, 2016 or so, and you looked at a lot of the global trends around climate, around the changes in the population, basically, you could see a few things happening. Number one, a huge percentage of the world's population lives within, I think it's like 100 kilometers of water and relies on fish protein as their primary protein source. It's a very large percentage. I forget exactly what it is. Secondly, if you looked at the changes with climate change, what was happening to the ocean and the wild fish populations, you could see things didn't look good. So the punchline of all of this is like, basically, as a species, humanity, we need fish farming and aquaculture to work, and we need it to work well and to be sustainable. And so we got very interested in this problem and started like exploring this together. And we saw an opportunity to build something to actually move this market. So the fish farming market is really driven by the salmon market, and specifically by the salmon market in Norway. They lead the world. So basically, whatever Norway does in salmon, the rest of the world will follow. This is like, if you think of the Tesla strategy of like, build the fancy thing first and then it comes down, that's Norway in fish.
Okay, perfect. So you mean in terms of technology advancements? That's
correct. Correct. Yeah. Like Norway is the world leader in salmon farming and arguably in aquaculture technology. So and part of the reason for that is that salmon is a premium fish. And so they have the money to invest in stuff. So that's just kind of how it goes. And so, anyways, so if basically we end up in this position where we did a partnership for a product that is now live in the world. What this product is it is essentially a decision support tool for fish farmers. And so if you're a fish farmer, you have, in a pen of, let's say, they have these very large pens, and inside a pen, you could have 100,000 fish that is, millions and millions of dollars worth of inventory just in this one pen. And so in pens and fish farming, this is all just a bunch of context, by the way, which hopefully will make this product make sense. When you have a bunch of fish in a pen, there are certain things that happen that are a problem that are not a problem in the wild. So one of these is a disease, or a pest called sea lice. It's like a little bug, and it's naturally occurring in the wild. It's not harmful to humans or anything like this. Happens in the wild. It's not really a problem. But when you have a bunch of fish in much closer quarters, like you would in a fish farm, this can get out of hand. And when it does, it gets bad fast. So this problem basically has, like, if it gets away on you and it runs away on you and you're a fish farmer, you're screwed. And so it's something that if you're a fish farmer, you have to stay on top of all the time. And the moment it gets ahead of you, you're at risk of losing your entire crop, which could knock your entire farm out of business. Like this is borderline existential threat kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's the context here and what's going on. So then if you look at all this at the same time, this is all setting a context for the strategy here, right? So the other thing is, so we have basically a wealthy market that is critically important to the world, and yet it was supply capped. Why was it supply capped? Because there are a lot of environmental and health concerns around the health of fish farms and the health of the fish coming out of those farms. And so literally there was essentially a regulatory limit in place by the Norwegian government on fish farms, which said, like, if you don't get this handled, like, you cannot expand. So if you imagine being a CEO of one of these farming companies, you have essentially existential pressure on you where you can't actually expand unless you solve this problem. Okay, here we are. Now we have the context for why there was something to build here. So
I will later ask about how you get all that context, but let's move on with the story.
All right, great. Yeah. So this is the context of why there was a thing to do here. And so if you're, for example, the biggest company in the world, and this is well known on the internet, you can find it, is now called Mowi. I think it's MOWI. It's one of the biggest fish farming companies in the world. They're number one in Norway, or at least they were last time I checked. So if you were the CEO of that company, you couldn't grow your company. That's a problem. That's a big problem. It's a very,
you're
very
willing
big
to
problem.
pay a lot of money to solve it.
Yeah, you're gonna invest in solving this problem. And so the solution was basically, all right, we got to get this sea lice thing under control, both to be able to expand, but also, so that's the upside. And the downside prevention is that if we don't, and it gets out of hand on us, we could lose an entire crop. We can lose millions and millions of dollars, or whatever the equivalent was in your currency of choice. So this is the context. This is why it's important. And so the solution was, there has got to be a better way to do this. And so the opportunity that we saw is that the way this problem historically was handled, I kid you not, is you would take two like 19-year-old guys, and you'd put them in a little boat, and they'd go out there like once a week and fish a bunch of, like, they would like take a little net and pull like 20 fish out of the pen and like look at the fish, count what's on the fish. I swear, this is actually what happened. And you would basically make your decisions, your health treatment decisions, on this basis. And, you don't have to be a PhD in stats to know that that is not exactly the most like sophisticated method for making multi-million dollar decisions. And so, it doesn't take too long until you're like, all right, there's got to be a better way. And so indeed there is. And so what we ended up creating was a product. It is a product that is essentially, we built an underwater robotic system it's basically an underwater robotic system with computer vision. And so what it would do is it would basically sit in the pen with all the fish. And as fish go by, it would take really, really high res photos of these fish and then use computer vision to detect the level of pest infestation on these fish, do a bunch of population modeling, roll up all these stats, and basically turn it into a very actionable report for a farmer. So it could say, like, hey, Nacho, this is the lice load of the fish in pen 3. Here is it across the farm. Here is it across all your farm sites. Is it a problem? Is it going well? Are you good? Do you need to call in like XYZ treatment solutions, et cetera, et cetera? And so it was basically equipping the farmers with far better intelligence to make really important operational decisions. So that's the product. So tell me where you want to go with it.
No, it's interesting. You put these two 19-year-old boys out of business.
I swear.
Sounds reasonable.
I swear. This is actually how it was done for like 100 years.
The thing I had in my head was like, when we make fun of these product companies not experimenting very well, and you look at other industries and things can get worse. So it's an interesting example. The interesting part I want to kind of proceed on was kind of the process to coming up with the strategy. So I don't want to kind of infer it, but I guess that a lot of it was kind of pulling all this context that you share uh, was something did previous to strategy as sort of market research, or how do you come about all this wonderful information signaling that this is a very important problem?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's misleading, if you're the person listening to this and you hear a story like I just told, I think one of the things that's a little bit confusing or misleading about it is it feels like that's that all fit together very nicely, as if I just we went and just picked that up off a shelf or something. That's actually the output of a staggering amount of like research and discussion and analysis and yada yada yada. So talking about that is I think that sounds like where you want to explore is like how
Yeah,
do you get there? Okay.
yeah,
So I think, like a lot of things, it does start with market research and, looking at industry trends. In this case, we were also looking at like global population trends and climate trends, because that was something we were very interested in and cared about. Um, and so, I feel like it's not that hard actually to discover that there's a general problem area. I think the hard part is going from the general problem to the specific problem. So for example, it doesn't take very long to realize like, oh, in the case I just gave, it didn't take too long to realize like, oh, wow, this aquaculture thing is a big deal. And we've got to figure this out. Like that, you can get there pretty quickly. Then the question is like, what do you do about it? That's the part where I think the context becomes really important. And so what we did there was we started looking at a lot of the industry trends, and we said, okay, what does this supply chain look like? How, like, what is the chain of events? Like, how does fish even end up on your plate? Like when you go to the store and there's a fish there, how did it get there? And
the
who are all
fish
the
journey.
people? Yeah, exactly. What is the journey of the fish? Never mind the user. Let's talk about fish. Right. And so we were talking a lot about that. And but then there was other questions that it brought up as well, because if you trace the user experience, so let's take let's take the grocery store as like this handoff point, right? So before that point, we don't have users, we just have fish. And we have fish going through a supply chain. And then all of a sudden, we have Nacho with his family at the grocery store saying, let's have salmon tonight. You're picking up the salmon, you're going home with it, off you go. And so if we looked at this whole journey, which we did, there's different places you can jump in there to play. You can say, okay, do I want to talk about the traceability story, right? Do I want to look at, like, for you, the consumer, one of the things we considered was, okay, do we look at the traceability of the fish to tell you, here is where this fish came from, here's how it was handled, so it's healthy and sustainable and so forth.
Yeah.
That's an option. Another option was, you go back into the supply chain and every step along that way, and you say, okay, where is there an intervention point? So I think to actually say, how do you get the context is, first off, it's just a lot of conversations. And I think one of the big mistakes that people make is, I don't know if everybody makes this, but is thinking like you can just Google this stuff. Like, oh, I'm going to just go figure this out by Googling a bunch of industry reports and whatever. And I think you start there, but then you have to go talk to people. This is like customer development 101. This is Steve Blank stuff. So we got out of the building. We talked to, I have no idea how many people we talked to, but I talked to like statisticians who work for the Norwegian government. I talked to like the guy who's the Yoda of fish health in Norway. We just talked to like dozens, if not hundreds of people building this picture up. Now, granted, this was like a slow process and it took a while, but we were building a multi-year strategy. Am I answering your question? Feel free to redirect me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way the way I'm framing this is we are talking about the initial phase of the strategy, and maybe an interesting follow-up question is, how are you organizing all these options? So you are kind of being receiving or having all these conversations that probably spark a lot of potential opportunities. How are you mapping those?
Yeah, I love that question. So there's a few different frameworks I've used over the years. I like it. In your book, you talk about like the wall of insights. And I think that is an inevitable step that always happens, is you just end up with literally a giant wall of stuff, whether it's a physical wall or like a virtual one on Miro or whatever. Like you do need to put all this stuff together somewhere. At the time this was pre-pandemic. And so we were doing a lot of in-person stuff. So we literally had a couple war rooms in different places where we literally just had giant walls of stuff. And so there was like one wall that was a huge whiteboard of that entire journey I described, from like the salmon hatchling all the way to you eating dinner. There was like a giant whiteboard with every step in that process and all the categories of players in between, so that anytime we were having a conversation, we could say like, where are we in this journey? right? Are we talking this part or this part? So that was one thing. But I think the other thing that's interesting to explore is, I don't know if this is something you've covered with your audience before, but have you talked much about like Wardley mapping?
No, no, no.
Okay, so for just a bit of context, there's a guy named Simon Wardley. He created this thing called Wardley mapping. And it's a bit hard to get your head around at first, but in essence, it's one approach to mapping the world and insights and trying to contextualize this stuff and then predict what might happen. And so what it does is it maps the evolution of something against, it basically maps the evolution of a technology or a market over time. And then you can start to predict, well, what might happen next, because there are some predictable patterns. And so there was a number of ways we mapped this. The first one was, as I said, supply chain, all the players through the user journey. And then you zoom in on the part you chose. So we then realized, like, okay, the place that we could make the biggest difference with technology here was on the farm itself. And so then we did another map of the whole farm. And so we did the whole user journey within a farm context. And then the other thing was adding money to it. And so, what I mean by that is, like, what we started doing was we had a map that, everyone's familiar with user journey maps. That's super normal. Yeah. But then what we started doing was, like, literally adding denominations of money and where value would change hands in the form of currencies or contracts. Okay. And so, for example, the way, this is something I never knew before, but the way fish is bought and sold is on futures contracts. So it turns out that if you're a fish farmer, you already sold the fish like before it was even alive. And so we didn't know that. And so we found out that, like, somebody had already made a deal, and then they were targeting a contract to fulfill. They had pre-sold, I will deliver you this many kilos of salmon at this date in the future. And everything they did was aligned to that. And so that, like, when we discovered that, for example, like when we discovered that bit of context, that changed the map, because suddenly that was this early constraint that was missing from the map. And we realized, oh, everything we were looking at is actually shaped by something that we were not even aware of. And so I feel like I'm going around in circles a little bit, but I think the key here is to make it visual and make it accessible for everybody to hammer on. So I think it's very important, whether physically or virtually, that anyone involved in this thing can gather around the map, move some pieces around, and be like, hey, what do you think?
Yeah, perfect. And maybe that's a good jump to the next question, which is, okay, now you have all this world full of journeys, insights, potential areas of action. How do you start selecting? So what are the conversations, or what are the methods that you can use to select among those?
Yeah, I wish that I was as rigorous about it then as I am today, and as your book suggests, because it's obviously anyone listening to this is probably familiar with it. I wish that we were as rigorous about it then. The thing that we knew was important was focus, right? Everybody says that, but it's so hard, and that's a trope, but it's so true. And so the hard thing was saying, what are we not going to do? And so we were kind of taking more of a technology first angle on this, because there was a lot of other players going after the same opportunity. Okay. We were not the only people who saw this opportunity. That makes sense, right? You have a wealthy market, a lot of money to be had, a lot of opportunity to make a difference. There's going to be competition. Yeah. So we had to choose between, what are we going to pursue? Are we going to pursue this, like, lice management thing? Are we going to pursue something else, like, for example, biomass estimation, which is basically saying, like, remember that contract I said? Like, it's basically a way of estimating how many kilos do I have in that pen right now? Like, am I on track for my contract? So that was another one that was a really good contender. It was what do we do this biomass thing? Because that drives their entire business. And so what we looked at then was, we started to look at, like you might imagine, we looked at competitive opportunities. Like, what are the threats? Who are the existing players? What trajectory do we see for them? Do we see anything where there's actually an opportunity to jump ahead here? And is there a sequencing at play? So for me, I think first about cutting, and then I think about sequencing. And what I mean by that is, when I talk about cutting, everybody says focus, but everyone confuses the word focus with prioritization. And so the way I differentiate focus and prioritization is cutting versus ranking or ordering. And for me, focus is cutting. Like, we are cutting down the world. Once we've cut down the world, then we can prioritize it. And so my first job is to, like, how much can we take off the table? And I want to take as many things off the table as I can. And I am asking everyone to look at, where is the leverage? Where is the leverage financially, technologically? Where do we have a technological advantage? Like, do we know something? Are we good at something that other people weren't? And our answer at that time, this is go back to, well, when was this? This is 2017, 18, 19. We were really good at computer vision. We were early on that. So we had a really strong team of people who could actually write, the computer vision algorithms to do this work, which is insanely hard today. It was even harder then. This is like right as NVIDIA was starting to come up with their frameworks. There wasn't all the open source stuff there is today. And so we saw that as an edge. We said, okay, we think we can do something there. And so that was the angle we chose. We said, all right, look, there's a lot of people in the biomass space already. We don't really see an edge to be had. Like, it makes sense, but later, but we need momentum going into it. And so ask me in a second about the roll-up strategy that emerged. But just to start with the first product, it was like, where is a breakthrough product?
Okay.
Right. We knew there was a whole suite of products to be made here. You could build a massive business around all this stuff and all the needs of the farm, but how do you break through? And so the combination of a serious customer pain with getting this lice situation under control, it had suddenly become not just painful, but urgent because of this regulatory issue. And we saw that we could take a shot at this technical innovation that was at least 3 years ahead. And so that was how we made the bet. And so we said, we're not going to do biomass yet. We're not going to do traceability yet. We're not going to do all these other things that are important and good ideas, because we think this is the one that is burning and that there's a chance to break through with. So does that make sense in terms of how we cut down?
Absolutely. I mean, I love the combination of underserved need with strength that you can leverage to build an advantage. So it's a very, very clever. Sounds like a very clever decision, at least from your storytelling.
It always sounds better after the fact.
Perfect.
I can tell you, it was never so clean in the middle for anyone who thinks it is. It's always a bit of as Scott Belsky's book says, it's always a messy middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm interested in something you said in between, like the sequencing part, where you mentioned this breakthrough technology. So I have two kind of follow-up questions. The first one is, did you put a kind of time estimation between kind of, okay, we are kind of deciding on this and we need to, for sure, it's hardware products or build, how long will it take to build, to put in the market and so on? And then you mentioned sequencing. Is this kind of parting this idea into milestones, or is kind of sequencing after potential products?
When I was saying sequencing there, I was referring to more of a portfolio level strategy in terms of like a sequence of products to bring to market and like a series of different product market fits. So we felt confident that if we could do this lice thing and break through with that, there were quite a few other add-on opportunities and products that you could build out into a suite. And that's exactly what ended up happening, by the way. And we can maybe talk about that later. But to your point about the technology side, so this is 4 years ago, basically. And we were doing, I joke about it now that like we chose to make our life really hard in all the ways at the same time, where we decided to go with computer vision, which is hard today and was harder then. So it was not only computer vision, it was also embedded systems and robotics that were remote in the field. Like, they were off in fjords in Norway, 3,000 miles away from where I live. And they're, on top of all that, they're underwater in salt water. So I joke about that now of like, why did we do all this? And well, because that was the problem. So when I think about the sequencing you're asking about, there are a lot. This one was very complex because it had all these dependencies. So the hardware hardware, if anyone who's done hardware will tell you hardware is hard because it has just layers and layers of dependencies, and your cost of change is so much higher than in software. That's like the real thing, is that when you make a mistake or something's wrong, which is inevitable, it's just way more expensive and slower to fix. But the other piece, and this is just a tip for anyone who's thinking about doing a computer vision or AI type product, if you think you're going to do something like that, actually one of your biggest risks that you might overlook if you haven't done this before is a feasibility risk, which is the data you need to train the algorithms you want may not exist.
Interesting. That makes sense. I
Part
mean,
of the
for
reason
underwater
OpenAI,
fish.
right? Yeah, like where's that data set? I'll tell you, we made it, and it was expensive. It was very expensive, and it was a lot of work. And there's a whole other set of stories there of like, but if people wonder about like why has OpenAI blown so far ahead of other things, there's a lot of answers to that question that are valid. But another one is that they have actually made the investments in the data sets that other folks have not.
Yeah.
And so if you have any intention of doing an AI driven thing, you have to ask yourself early, does the data exist or do we have to go create it? Because if the answer is it does not exist and you have to go create it, you have a major sequencing and cost problem, which by the way, we learned the hard way.
Okay, got it. And maybe that's a good segue to the next phase. So seems to be that the hard part was this analysis and the selection. So the articulation of the strategy was simply saying, hey, this is the problem we are tackling and we will take this much time, or how actually kind of came about articulating I would call the final artifact for the strategy, if there was such a thing?
Well, there was it evolved, right? As one might expect. There was a first cut at this, and then it evolved in sequential passes. So the first pass was not as detailed or not as coherent as I described. We saw like there was an opportunity. We thought there was something here. Let's go put some work into this. We did a bunch of work, came back, and it was sort of this every 3 to 6 months updating and refreshing and adapting to what we were learning as we were going forward. And a lot of this because we had this, again, hardware and AI and getting the data and all this stuff. It took a while for us to get in market. It wasn't like launching a thing on the web where you just deploy it and off you go. So it took a while for us to start getting the market feedback we needed to start to shape the strategy. So it was a sequential thing, or maybe iterative is a better way to say it, where we had a first rough cut and then we figured out like, oh, we're 40% wrong here. Let's cut that down on this next pass. Let's get it down to 30% wrong. And what happened was as each time we went back and updated the strategy, we got a little less wrong. So that was good. But the other thing that I think is important to describe here is that each pass, you actually are seeing new opportunities. So the thing I said about the sequencing of products where we said, oh, there's all these other things you could build. You could build the biomass, you could build the tracking, the traceability, whatever. We actually didn't see all that up front. We only saw really the first opportunity around the lice thing. And we said, we think that's the one. Let's see what else there is. As we went forward, this sequencing emerged within fish. And then even further, fast forward a year, we saw the sequencing available across species. So this actually became the cornerstone of a multi-species roadmap. And what that means is if you're in animal health, like there are veterinarians, right? Like there's doctors for animals like there are for humans. And so if you're an animal health company, you deal with fish, you deal with cows, you deal with pigs, with chickens, whatever. And each of those is an entire world unto itself. And so as we went forward, what actually emerged was, oh, there's an opportunity here to make this thing that we're talking about, this like shift from being purely selling physical products, selling like drugs to make fish healthier, for example, to selling services that are digitally powered and tech enabled. And that insight that you could go from selling physical products to help farmers to selling them digital services to help farmers, that realization became the realization that powered what is now a multi-species, multi-industry roll-up that was, I can't share the number, but like billions and billions of dollars of enterprise value.
So that portfolio strategy that you were referring to before.
Yeah, but the thing I want to stress there is that the portfolio strategy emerged.
Yeah.
We didn't see that up front.
I have several questions to that. So the first one maybe is, so this thing that was at the beginning 40% wrong, what was it? So what's the shape, the artifact? Was there something?
Oh, sorry, the artifact. I apologize. I didn't realize that was the question you wanted.
No, that's fine.
So there's a number of different ways to do it. I like to do it a few ways. First off, I like to push the thinking in prose first. So I'm a big fan of, like a 6-pager, for example.
Yeah, perfect.
I love a 6-pager written just in Markdown where there's no option to make this thing visually fancy. It has to stand completely on its own, on its own 2 feet. And so that was the first round. And so we would hammer on that internally and, send this thing back and forth, and I'd send a draft and somebody would say, they'd mark it up and do passes and send it back. And we'd do that for a while. And then once that felt really solid, that's not a very good asset to distribute. Like a lot of people, especially like your teams, the IC folks who are heads down building stuff, a lot of them aren't going to stop and read a 6-pager. It's like the wrong context or wrong altitude in a lot of ways. So then it was, how do we distill this thing down for the team? And so what I started doing was at we did a quarterly update. And so every quarter I would have this kickoff meeting and I would update all the teams on how this was going. And I'd have different people come in and talk about pieces of what we had learned. So we'd have one of my stakeholders who really knew about the farmers would talk about that. One of the stakeholders who really knew about the data would talk about that. The tech lead who was on top of the algorithms would talk about that, so on and so forth.
How often you said that?
So there was of course the first kickoff for it, but then every quarter we would do a refresh, or not a refresh, an update. Like it'd just be like, hey, like this is how it's changing, because most of my teams, they would be very heads down, as you would expect, right? They're building stuff all day. Yeah. And so when you're in that environment, it's easy to lose sight or kind of lose track of the larger context. And so I would just always be doing, every quarter, I would try to refresh that context. And then what I would do is pick one or two things. And at every weekly meeting, I would just share one anecdote or one story just to kind of like refresh the context before we got into the weeds of whatever was going on that week. Especially because we had these long lead time things with hardware, with AI algorithms and computer vision and so on and so forth. I was very concerned that the engineering teams, which were pretty extensive here and distributed, by the way, across different countries, and I was concerned that people would get out of sync and start running in 5 directions. And so I was constantly trying to update the context. And then one other trick that we did, and this is something that I can't believe is not more popular, but I think this is useful for people. Every time I had a clarification conversation with somebody, like let's say I was in my tech lead's office and we had a whiteboard session about whatever, where he would be like, I don't understand this. Why are we doing this? We'd hash it out, and whatever emerged, at the end of it, we would do a 1-minute video. And so just like standing at the whiteboard, I'd be like, hey, walk me through what's on this whiteboard from your perspective. And this being my tech lead, because I had already said my stuff. We wanted his perspective. And so I'd be like, hey, walk us through this thing on the whiteboard. And he would. And it takes 45 seconds, but that would encapsulate like an hour and a half of discussion. And then we drop it in the Slack channel. It'd be like, yo, update, check this out. Everybody would watch it because it's 45 seconds. And so it was this really lightweight way to keep people, like, it just was a little heartbeat of staying up to date on like the context. Like, what are we doing? Why does this matter? Wait, what are we doing again? Like, it was that.
Love that. We should push for that more. I have one. So related to what you're saying about this kind of long lead time. So what was the time frame for the strategy? And the second one, and maybe closely related, is how were you measuring success? Because it's kind of a very new thing that will ship in a long time. So how you make sure that this will actually succeed before wasting millions in building it?
It's a great set of questions. I think usually we would be targeting something like the next year, right? Because we knew this was moving. It was moving and changing pretty quick. Like even every 3 to 6 months, there was a new player in the market, a new startup going after this or whatever. So we were targeting like roughly a year. And so it was almost just like rolling 1-year windows where, come up with a thing, 3 to 6 months later, we're updating that, and we're now pushing out a year again. And so now we're actually looking out to what would have been 18 months from the original start, but then you do it again. And so now you're at 24 months out. And so that was what we did in the first, frankly, like probably 2 to 3 years. And then later, as we got into market and we started to see like the bigger picture of what was available in terms of like the portfolio strategy, then you started to see like a multi-year, 3 to 5 years out kind of thing. But in the beginning, it was not that, for sure. And there was and I also want to be clear, like there was a lot of really smart people involved in this. This is like, I was sort of helping. I was one player in this process. I'm not the only one doing this, just to be really clear about that. Now your second one, I mean, a lot of great people involved in this. So to your second question of like, how do you know it's going to be successful? I mean, once you're in market, you're getting direct customer user feedback. You're starting to see sales numbers, those kinds of things. That's pretty straightforward. The trickier bit is, I think, that you're asking about is before that. Is that?
Yeah.
right?
And by the way, how long did it take to get to market? So I imagine this 1 year period was not to get to market, was just kind of having some reference.
It would depend on your definition of getting to market. If your definition of getting to market is, I mean, we were sort of quote unquote in market with early prototypes, definitely in year one. I mean, we had stuff in the water within the first year. And that was expensive and difficult and all the things. But we also we knew we were going to be wildly wrong about a ton of assumptions technically. Cause again, remember, we're talking about computer vision underwater remotely. There's so many things that can go wrong. And so we were doing a lot of prototypes, and we got stuff in the water within a single digit number of months. I don't remember if it was 5 months or 8 months, but it was definitely a single digit number of months. And so we were getting feedback pretty quickly on the feasibility side, and really those were also going at farms. So we had, you could think of it as like a customer development program. Yeah. We had farms we were working with, and we were embedding early tech in their farms to, run it alongside. We would run stuff alongside their existing 2 guys in a boat system and understand, is this going to work? Is this better?
Good.
And I'd get, emails from farm managers. They're like, the thing is so wrong. What the hell? And so we'd be like, oh God, all right, we have to go figure that out. So we did all the kind of customer development type things that you would hope you would do, right? We had tech in the water, in the field, a lot of flights across the Atlantic, a lot of flying people around to farms and traveling and that kind of thing, which if anyone's running a distributed team now, please get your people together in a room as soon as possible. You need the FaceTime.
Interesting. And maybe, so I assume that this may be a big assumption, but the feasibility, so the being able to build the thing was the really risky part, since it was kind of such a painful problem solved in a very ugly way and a lot of money on the table, that the kind of the market, if you can solve it, the market was there.
Largely. So this one was definitely way, way high on feasibility risk. So feasibility risk was like a 9 or a 10 out of 10. Usability was, I don't know, 5. Value was pretty low risk. We knew there was a really painful problem here. The viability, though, was a real risk. This is a very complex business with a lot of moving pieces, a lot of questions of what's the business model? Could we sell it for enough? Would the numbers make sense, et cetera? So I would say the viability was like an 8. And that took an enormous amount of work. But in terms of the core value to the customer, actually, it was a little higher than you would think. Actually, I'm giving it it's too obvious in retrospect. But at the time, it was not as obvious, because there was a fair number of farms for whom the existing solution of 2 dudes in a boat was okay. Honestly, they were like, hey, I've been doing it this way for years and I'm okay. And so there actually was some real questions there of okay, which subsegment of the market actually has this problem enough that they're going to be willing to really pay, because homie over there with his 2 pens doesn't care. He's got his 2 sons in a boat and they're free or cheap, right? So there actually was some more value risk than one would say in retrospect. At the time, it was not so clear.
Interesting. Yeah. And then I'm thinking about kind of the adoption curve and all these things that can play out, but that makes sense.
Okay. I remember I had a spreadsheet somewhere that had mapped out every farm in Norway and had an estimate of where they were on that adoption curve and trying to come up with this crazy go-to-market plan. It was absurd.
Okay, I think that the story can continue forever, but I want to kind of, because of time, and maybe come back in time and now understand how your thinking about strategy evolved over time. So I know that you have been in from a different position, helping other companies. So what would you say are some major learnings or differences in how we are doing things now?
Yeah, thanks. So I would say the core principles of strategy, which I think are well articulated, like in your book, in Marty's book, for example. There's a lot of good strategy ideas out there that give you the shape of the principles. So I don't think that I think very differently about that. It's still equally important to cut down the optionality and to cut and then prioritize or sequence, by the way. That I don't think that's changed at all. I think what has changed in terms of my own thinking and process, for example, there's a sleep tech company. It's one of my clients now that I'm working with. They're called Sleep Space. They gave me permission to talk about them. And so one of the things that we're doing is I call it the leadership strategy stack. And it's sort of it's really, I guess what I'm saying is I value even more the strategic context now
Mhm.
than I did then. And what I mean by strategic context in this case is not just the market context and like the problem and the stuff that I said at the very beginning of this conversation of like why this is a thing and why there's an opportunity and all that, but really the stuff like the hard thinking that founders and leaders do. Like, what are we really doing here? Why? What does it look like? Like the stuff that it sounds super fuzzy until it sounds really, really fuzzy until you're the one who has to come up with it. And then you realize, like, oh, wow, this is shaping literally everything we do. And so this is something that usually is falling on CEOs, heads of product, and founders, frankly. This is usually the people I talk to about this stuff. And for me, it's like a 7-part stack. And there's similar models out there. You know, there's the decision stack by Martin Erickson. That's great. There's plenty of models. We're all saying the same thing. And for me, I what I think is important is A, that you cover all the pieces of the stack, which I'll name in a second. And B, that we're clear about terms. Like a lot of these terms get thrown around without any definition on them. So for me, there's seven pieces in the stack, which will all sound probably very familiar. But to me, this is kind of like the whole picture. First of all is purpose. And this is what a lot of people call this mission. But what I mean, it's like, why are we doing this? Like, what's the point of this whole thing? And this is the sort of the feel good, inspiring, subjective statement, right? And then the next one is vision. And so vision, I think the number one thing that everybody gets wrong about vision is you can't see it. Like I talk to so many people and they're like, oh, I'm like, what's the product vision? Run me through it. And they don't show me anything. They start spouting off words at me that don't necessarily make a lot of sense and nobody's excited about it. There's no emotion. Like I want to see it and it needs to be emotional and resonant because humans are wired to think in pictures and stories. That is all people really remember. And so your vision needs to be pictures and stories. You can hang the numbers onto it later, but pictures and stories, okay? And so you don't have to spend $500,000 like a big enterprise would, you know, to make a gorgeous video. I mean, if you have the budget, you want to go for it. And there's some great examples of like, I really love if you go back like 7 years, the Microsoft productivity vision is a great example. John Deere had a great one from like 5 to 8 years ago. These are just on YouTube. SpaceX, these are great. These are great examples of a vision. They hit you, you see them, they're emotional, etc. Number 3 is values. Like, for me, I think of a road trip. Like we're doing this big trip, we're driving somewhere. Like, what are the rules of the road? How do we choose to hold ourselves accountable? And I think the big thing that gets missed on values is everyone does what I like to call mom and apple pie values. You know, it's like stuff that everybody would say, like integrity. You're like, okay, well, for who is that not true? Like, if it's true for everyone, then we're not saying anything, right? So I want something that takes a stance, and then I want to see it mapped into behavior. So, okay, if you say, for example, we value beauty, that is something that not everybody would say, right? There are companies like Asana, for example, values design. They value aesthetics is one example, or Tesla, like they value aesthetics. A ton of companies would not say that. And then I want to say, like, what does that mean in behavior? Like, how does a team member know if they're doing it? So that was number 3. That's values. Number 4 is mission. I call it mission, but this is like the goal. This is like, I need something. What's the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal? What is the concrete mission that we are going for? And the reason I separate out mission from purpose in this sense, because a lot of people use those terms interchangeably. I grew up in a military family, and to me, missions were something we talked about. And missions in my world are concrete and achievable. And the way the mission is often used, it is not that. It is not concrete nor achievable. It's an intention. So purpose is more like an intention. Mission, it should be achievable. It should be a real thing. We can say we did it or not. Okay. Now, just to wrap this up, we have strategy. Now we're very much in your wheelhouse and all the stuff we've been talking about. It's like, cool, we have a goal, we got a vision. What are we going to do? How are we doing this thing? And then we have objectives, which should make lots of sense to people of like, how do we map that into big goals and milestones effectively? And then lastly is principles, right? So product principles. And for me, the acid test of product principles is, if you're a product leader, does this enable your teams to make the decisions you hope they make when you are not around?
Yeah. That makes sense.
Because that's like the point of principles and all this stuff is to enable scalable quality decision making. It's like good decision making with high autonomy. That's the point.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
was thinking
that's
about,
what I think. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was along the lines of what you were saying. I was thinking about you mentioned kind of this gain importance over time. So maybe to ask you why, what was maybe the trigger, or how your thinking changed about having more clarity about this stack?
Yeah, no, I love that question. So I think the reason it emerged for me was I listened to one of your other episodes. I can't remember which guest it was. And he said, like, I used to be an engineer and I keep asking why. And people would say, just because. And it drove him crazy. And I had the same thing. I always asked why. And I cannot stand the answer because that's how it is. And so I just found that for myself and most folks that I talked to, their performance was better, their motivation was higher, and they were a lot more fulfilled when they could see the bigger picture, because then they could connect. You know, if I think of a junior engineer on one of my teams, who I would, have an occasional like skip level with, his work was so much better, or the data scientist, her work was so much better when she could see the bigger picture, because I couldn't be there all the time. And so they made better decisions and they felt better. They were more fulfilled. Mm-hmm. Our retention was better. Everybody was happier. Yeah. And that stuff matters to me. And so I think that's where it was, where, it's great to have the business, the hard business case and that side of strategy. You got to have it. But I think more and more, I just started really thinking about, like, what is the environment we are creating, the culture for these humans. And so that's why I started really emphasizing that. And I just found that a lot of people in my work now, a lot of folks that I sit with, haven't really done the hard thinking on these things. And so their foundation's a little shaky for what they're building. And that's not a good foundation to build a company on.
Super interesting, because I'm not sure if this happened to you, but usually the reaction I got to all this strategy framework is, hey, this is a lot of work. And then as we progress, we understand that, hey, this is not the only work you need to do. There's even more work you need to do to be a good leader. So yep. I don't know how to deal with these reactions.
I just say, yeah, you're right. It is a lot of work. Like that is correct. Yes, that is accurate. Let's go. But it's essential, right? Because, like, and this is where I when I talk with like a CEO or a founder or a head of product, I'm like, you're right. It is a lot of work, but what's going to happen if you don't do it? Mm-hmm. Seriously, you're going to have people making all kinds of decisions when you are not around, going in like 12 different directions, maybe making decisions that you don't agree with, like on an ethical basis, or that go against your company values, because you haven't done the work to create and communicate a context. Everybody wants to be a part of something, right? We're wired this way as humans. And so this is our work as leaders, to make something that people want to be a part of. This is building an environment for people to excel in and thrive in. And I think that's like essential work of a leader.
I'm getting completely off track, but it's interesting because I'm going to continue thinking on this. Leaders are eager to discuss, or many times are eager to discuss, features with teams instead of doing this hard work of building the strategic context for them to make the good decisions.
It's hard.
Luckily, they can now be coached by Andrew and can get their clear thinking.
Sure, give me a call. Happy to do it. But you're right. It is easier to talk about features than it is to sit down and grapple with these hard questions. These are the questions but these are the ones that keep you up at night. Maybe that's your other upside. You'll sleep better.
That's interesting.
Hey, every leader I know could go for that.
No, but what's interesting also is that you are paying these people to think about those features, and they're probably more capable than you to do so. So you need to do your work. But
exactly, anyway, right? It's like, you very rein me in here, because I might go on a rant. But you very quickly get into the question of, like, well, what is the job of a leader? And there's a lot of answers to that question that people have given over the years. But one assertion I would make about that is the job of leadership is to create an environment where people can thrive and excel at their best. And when you start thinking there's a great metaphor from, I think it's from the book Team of Teams. It's this idea of like leading like a gardener. And it's like, you don't have to do anything to make a plant grow. Like, if you're a gardener, you can't force a plant to grow, but you can create the conditions for it to thrive. And people are kind of like that. so we can create the conditions for our people to grow and thrive, which, by the way, is what drives our entire business and all of our results and success and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, be a gardener.
Perfect. I love it. Okay, maybe I should close with the typical question. So what's some learning about strategy that you had along the years that we didn't cover, even though we covered a lot?
I think we covered a lot. I'm trying to think if there's something I've got that we haven't said. I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but I just want to revisit. I think the biggest learning is kind of what we were hinting at here in this last section. Everybody knows that focus is important. That doesn't mean they do it, but they know it's important. But the thing that I think a lot of people don't give sufficient weight to is the power of culture. And this goes back to like, not just the operating context, but the environment we were just speaking about. One of my big learnings is that culture is extremely powerful. And the reason, I forget who told me this, but like the way that it's stuck in my head is this idea that context is decisive, which is another way of saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, strategy is super important, but you can have the best strategy in the world. If your culture sucks, it won't matter.
Yeah. And hopefully, going back to what you were saying, this strategy should be aligned to all these other pieces that are the ones forming your culture, kind of values and purpose and all that. Love that. Yeah. Okay, this has been wonderful. Many insights, many stories. Where can people find you? Where do you want to
I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, you can get me online. Go to makethingsthatmatter.com. You can, all links to everything is there. And if you like any of the stuff that we were talking about here, I do a short 2-minute daily newsletter for product leaders. It'll basically help you be a better product leader in 2 minutes a day. Go to productleadershipdaily.com.
Love it. Thank you so much. And let's stay in touch.
All right. Thanks, Nacho.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of 100 Product Strategies, the podcast by Product Direction. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram to get access to free weekly content that helps product people upgrade their skills and become more successful. You can access more material, promotional trainings, and be notified of every episode of the show with Product Direction's weekly newsletter. Join thousands of product leaders by registering in productdirection.co.